The federal government wants all new vehicle sales in Canada to eventually be electric, and today it announced a plan to get there. By 2026, 20% of all vehicles sold by automakers must emit zero emissions. That share jumps to 60% by 2030, with the end goal of phasing out all gas-powered trucks and cars by 2035 and offering only electric. Automakers that miss those targets will be forced to pay up. Stephen Guilbeault is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. He joins me now to discuss the new regulations. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So why should Canadians be forced to buy a zero-emissions vehicle?
Actually, Canadian wants to buy electric vehicles, and unfortunately, they can't. There's a long waiting list, 6 months to almost 2 years for certain models. And we've seen sales in Canada triple over the last 3 years. So there is clearly a demand. And the reason why we're putting this availability standard in place is to ensure that Canadians can have access to those vehicles, which are cleaner and more affordable for Canadians to drive.
But not every Canadian wants to buy one. There was a recent J.D. Power report that came out just a few months ago, and it found that 2/3 of Canadians are reluctant to buy an EV. And that's, to me, an eye-popping figure. That tells me a majority of people don't want anything to do with these vehicles. So how do you bring them on side with your plan, Minister?
I think what I've seen, and I used to work on electric vehicles a lot before my time in politics, and once people have tried it, 8, if not 9 out of 10 Canadians prefer sticking to electric vehicles. So there's a lot of perceptions and preconceptions about electric vehicles, them not working in the cold, about the battery ranges. And those Canadians who have adopted electric vehicles, by and large, don't want to go back. So what we're proposing is that by 2035, we progressively make it easier and easier to buy electric vehicle. And so 12 years from now, 100% of new vehicles sold would have to be electric vehicles, but people who have gas-powered engine would be able to continue using them past 2035. They just wouldn't be able to buy new ones after 2035.
I want to get to the cold weather and the range issues in a second, but let's just zero in on cost right now. A lot of people, the reason they say they're not buying an electric vehicle is because it does cost considerably more than an internal combustion engine right now. And there is a federal incentive that the government has rolled out. It's about $5,000, but a Ford F-150 Lightning, the F-150, the most popular model in Canada, the electric equivalent goes for about $80,000 right now. So cost being a big issue for people, does Ottawa have to step up? Does it have to up its game on incentives?
Well, 2 things. On average, the cost difference between a gas-powered vehicle and an electric vehicle is between $3,000 and $7,000. So the $5,000 incentive by the federal government is pretty spot on. It will fully compensate for some vehicle, not quite for others. On average, we're not going to the extreme price range here. And number one, but number two, when you look at the purchase of a vehicle, you have to look at the operating cost. And there's an independent study by Clean Energy Canada that shows that over a 10-year span, the electric vehicle will enable Canadians to save $3,000 per year. So $30,000 over a 10-year period versus a comparable sedan, for example, electric versus gas powered. So they are real benefit because the electricity is cheaper than gasoline. You don't see price volatility with electricity as you're seeing with the price of oil and therefore the price of gasoline. The price of maintenance is much cheaper. So they are real economic benefits for Canadians going electric.
There may be economic benefits for consumers, but a lot of the automakers are not really feeling those economic benefits, especially here in North America. We'll get to China in a minute, but Ford just cut its EV manufacturing in half. General Motors slashing $2 billion in planned spending. A lot of the car makers are saying that they don't see the same sort of sales demand that they were expecting. They don't really see demand meeting supply right now. Is there something that you know that the car manufacturers don't?
As I was saying, in the last 3 years, we've seen sales in Canada triple. We went from 4% at the end of 2020 to more than 13% at the beginning of 2023, and we're not at the end of the year yet. In Quebec, it's more than 1 in 5 vehicles sold is an electric vehicle. In British Columbia, 1 in 4. So there is clear demand, and in fact, we've seen in Canada investment of $34 billion in part by the federal government, provinces, companies like Volkswagen, Stellantis, GM, and Northvolt, and many others. So the transformation to electric vehicle is happening in Canada, it's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in China, it's happening pretty much all over the world.
I mentioned China. They're a big beneficiary of your mandate. They're really the world's leading electric vehicle manufacturer. Let's show our audience this chart. There's been a 2,700% increase in Chinese electric vehicle imports to Canada. We know China, of course, has an appalling human rights record. Their mining practices are questionable at best. These vehicles are built largely in coal-powered car plants. The industry is controlled by the communist government. Does any of that give you pause?
Well, certainly when you look at our entire electrification strategy, what we're doing, we're investing $1.7 billion in the critical mineral sector to ensure that we can get those minerals in Canada, that they can be processed either in Canada or by some of our allies, whether it's the United States, Europe, Scandinavian countries, to ensure that we can be less dependent. Because right now, it is true that the world depends for many of these components largely on China, but many of Canada and many of our allies are working together to change that.
But 90% of all electric vehicle batteries in the world are somehow dependent on China right now. Are you concerned about handing over boatloads of Canadian cash to China, given what we know about how they run their country?
Well, most of the electric vehicles that are sold in Canada are made in North America right now. It is true that we've seen an increase in sales from Chinese vehicles, but it went from nothing to a bit more. But the most sold electric vehicle sold in Canada right now is a Tesla, manufactured in North America.
And China, right? They have a huge gigafactory in Beijing and Shanghai. So.
Yeah, but that's not where we're getting our Tesla from in North America. We're getting them from North American manufactured Tesla. The ones that are made in China are for the Chinese market. They're not selling those cars here. And again, I mean, what we're trying to do is and it's not just Canada. We're working with many of our allies to be less dependent from Chinese components, because the world is moving towards the electrification. Like there's no doubt about it. Just 3 years ago, 1 in 25 cars sold in the world was electric. Last year, 1 in 3 on average, 1 in 5. My apologies. On average in the world. So this is where the world is heading, but we need to ensure that we can diversify our components and be less dependent on China. And that's why the federal government is investing massively to make that happen in Canada.
There has been an uptick, as you say, but it does seem to have plateaued. I mean, at least that's what the car manufacturers are saying. They're concerned. They don't want to pump out any more of these cars, or at least on the scale that they were hoping to do, because there is not really that demand right now. They are dialing it back significantly, and what they're hearing from their customers is that range anxiety is a big part of it. People are worried about having access to a charging device when they're running low on power. And it's not just access to a device, it's also, in many instances, I was looking at one study today, 1/4 of all public chargers aren't working at any given time. They're broken, there's network issues. What's your message to people who are anxious about this new technology?
Well, I mean, the sales figures that we're seeing, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere around the world, as I said earlier, the sales have tripled in Canada. So this idea that the demand isn't there, that's not what the data is showing us. In BC and Quebec, where they've put in place similar programs many years ago, their sales are 2 to 3 times what we're seeing on the national average. And what is true of Canada is true of the US, it's true of Europe, it's true of many places in the world. You know, when Henry Ford developed the Model T, he didn't say, "Oh my goodness, you know, there's no gas stations. How will I be able to sell my vehicles?" He built it, and everything came with it, and that's what we're doing in Canada. And you should also remember that 80% of electric vehicle owners will charge at home. Their gas stations will be the household. So there is this 20% of customers who need public charging stations, and people when they go longer distances, like not commuting for work, for example, which is why the federal government has invested so far in the installation of 10,000 charging stations in Canada, which brings the total to 25,000 stations, and we will triple that number by 2029, we will be around 85,000 charging stations across the country, which on a per capita basis will put Canada in a fairly advantaged situation compared to many of our competitors, whether it's the US or many European countries.
This plan seems fine if you live in a suburban home in a major city, but what happens if you live in a condo? I mean, I was looking at data today from Natural Resources Canada. Only less than half of Canadians actually have a garage. So a lot of people don't have a garage. So if you're going to force people to buy a car that has to be plugged in, what do those people do?
As I said, you don't have to have a garage to be able to charge your vehicle at home. 80% currently in Canada, 80% of vehicle owners charge at home, whether they have a garage or not. What we're seeing in many urban areas, and we're seeing that in Canada, we're seeing that in many European countries, for example, is that you will have reserved parking space, and I see it in my neighborhood, reserved parking space for electric vehicles where people can charge overnight with charging stations that are deployed by municipalities across the country. We're seeing charging stations being deployed at the workplace. So more and more, it's going to be easy to charge an electric vehicle than it is today. In fact, in Quebec, for example, there are more charging stations for electric vehicle than there are gas stations. So we are seeing a very rapid deployment in some parts of the country. And what we're trying to do as a federal government is to ensure that we see that from coast to coast.
But do you not see it as a problem that so many people don't have a garage? So they're supposed to leave their car on the street overnight and hope all is well and charge it in some public space? Like, it does seem like that would be a huge stress on the system. Will there be enough infrastructure for all the urban dwellers that don't have a garage?
That's what's happening now. Sales have tripled and in the last 3 years. And some people have access to home charging stations. Some people use public charging stations. Seems to be working just fine.
So you mentioned Quebec and BC a lot, but of course this is a big country and there's a lot of rural and remote areas. And Alberta Premier Daniel Smith was raising some major concerns today, saying this mandate makes no sense for people who live in the country where there's very little charging infrastructure, where the temperatures drop well below zero, and there are concerns about range on some of these vehicles. What do you say to people like her and the people she represents?
Well, first, the technology is improving quite rapidly in terms of range, in terms of temperature, but also the regulation we announced today, the standard, the availability standard we announced today, also has provisions for plug-in hybrids, which, as you know, have an electric engine as well as a gas-powered engine. A plug-in hybrid will give you anywhere between 40 and 80 kilometers of autonomy on your batteries, and then you'll switch to gas, to good old internal combustion engine, which is perfect for rural, remote areas where we don't have yet been able to deploy the charging network that we need. And remember that, you know, we're phasing this in over a 12-year period. Like it's not happening tomorrow morning. It is going to happen progressively between now and 2035. So we have time to deploy the infrastructure. But for those people who still want to use gasoline engine, the plug-in hybrids are a perfect alternative.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you so much to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Stephen Guilbeault. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
For a response from industry, Brian Kingston is here. He's the President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. So, Brian, you say, I was reading your statement from earlier today, you say the new regulations will leave Canadians out in the cold. Why do you say that?
Well, the proposed regulation is inflationary and it's unrealistic. Inflationary because according to Environment Canada, it will reduce vehicle availability across Canada, it will increase prices, and it will have disproportionate and negative impacts on low-income Canadians, rural Canadians, and northern Canadians. It's unrealistic because we don't have enough charging infrastructure. There are 25,000 public chargers across this country right now. We need 442,000 by 2035. That means building 35,000 public chargers every single year from right now through to 2035, and I see no path to get that done.
Yeah, I mean, that's one issue I put to the minister was there's not really a lot of charging infrastructure. I was looking at a chart today of all the various countries around the world and how they've fared in terms of rolling out this sort of infrastructure. We have very little really compared to much of the rest of the world. There's only about 1 in 20, I think it is. Like for every one electric vehicle, for every what is it? Yeah, one vehicle, there's 20 charging stations, or vice versa. I can't get that right. 20 vehicles, one charging station. But so that seems relatively high, but it's really not enough when you consider that not everyone can charge at home, right? Like I was putting that to him as well. Not everyone has a garage. Some people actually have to put their cars out on the street and rely on what the public infrastructure is available to them. So do you think that the government has heard your concerns? I mean, you've been making that fairly clear to them for a while now, and yet they have this announcement today and they're not really necessarily addressing everything that you've raised. Like, are they just brushing you aside?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say they haven't listened, because we've been making these points for a couple of years now, and the industry is committed to electrification. We've gone from 3 models in the Canadian market in 2012 to 77 today. Inventories have increased exponentially. If you want an EV, you can buy an EV in Canada. And what we've been telling government is we now need to ensure that we have the demand to reach these targets. It's not just going to be public infrastructure. That's really important, of course, but we also have to address the affordability challenge facing Canadians. Canadians are facing all sorts of cost pressures, and there is a price gap between an electric vehicle and a gas-powered vehicle. Current incentives on offer simply don't close that gap. So I was hoping that today we'd see more details about really a supercharged plan to get us to these targets, and instead we were just left with a mandate that really dictates what Canadians can and can't buy.
Yeah, the minister said, though, they have a $5,000 federal incentive that can maybe help close the gap between an internal combustion engine car and an EV. Is that not enough? Is $5,000 not going to close it?
It's simply not enough. If you look at the United States as an example, they offer a $10,000 incentive in the form of an income tax rebate. In some provinces, we do have additional incentives, and that's where you see provinces leading in terms of electric vehicle sales. Quebec and BC have incentives in place. You stack that with the federal incentive, and then you're starting to make a difference. But in a lot of provinces, we don't have incentives. So we need a stronger federal incentive. We need other provinces to step up. And then I think we can start to get at that affordability issue. But right now, it's not feasible.
You say the industry is committed to EVs, but Ford slashing production. I think they're cutting the F-150 Lightning production in half. GM, General Motors, announced big cuts to its spending. I think it was like $2 billion cut from what they had planned to spend on EV production. Are the automakers signaling that demand just isn't there? Like, have the market dynamics changed considerably since when these plans were first announced? Has there been a decline in what people are willing to spend and how many people want an EV?
Yeah, well, we've seen huge investments, first of all, into this transformation. $15 billion from Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis alone. Majority of that is dedicated to EV assembly and the battery supply chain. So this is fantastic news for the Canadian economy. But with some of these production cuts, that is an exact response to the fact that demand isn't as high as it was previously. And so if we're going to get to 20% in 26, 60% in 2030, and 100% in 2035, we need to create the conditions for demand. Automakers don't control what Canadians buy. We can help nudge them there, though, with strong incentives, better infrastructure, and I think those targets could become achievable. But with the current suite of supports, it's just not possible.
So you are still committed. The industry is still committed to full electrification. Like, they're all right with that. They don't mind phasing out internal combustion engines. It's been your bread and butter for, 100 plus years. Like, that's something you're prepared to do.
This is the direction that industry is going. This is the technology that has proven to be most successful. If we look globally, we're talking about $1.2 trillion in investment that's dedicated to this. So this is the direction. We are moving towards full electrification. And that's what makes today's announcement so frustrating, suggesting that this is needed to encourage the industry to move in this way. This is happening. And we've shown many examples of different facilities that are being converted to electric. We don't need a new, redundant, and frankly costly regulation in place when this is already well underway.
I want to address another issue just before I let you go. That's China. I mean, we know that China really is the world's factory when it comes to electric vehicles. And some folks were saying today this is really going to benefit them because they have such an advantage on battery technology. They're producing so many vehicles. We put some stats up for the audience earlier today that shows imports into this country are up 2,700% over last year. We're just really being flooded with Chinese-made electric vehicles. Is that something that's a problem for your folks, your industry? I mean, has the government unwittingly just boosted the Chinese economy, really, by pushing forward with this mandate at this time?
It's a huge problem, and it underlines a complete disconnect between the federal government's economic policies and its environmental policies. We've seen Minister Freeland and Minister Champagne really supporting the industry, helping to attract major generational investments into Canada to help push this electrification. And yet, on the other hand, we have this policy which could very well benefit manufacturers based in China. We need to continue to work with the Americans, align our policies with the United States. This industry is totally integrated with the US. It has been since the 1960s. Every single government has recognized that. This is a very unique change in policy from the federal government, and it will have economic consequences.
Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you. Brian Kingston, the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association President and CEO. Thanks for your time.